Good afternoon, good evening, or in my case, good morning to everyone joining us, and welcome to this MIP Alumni Conference session on equality, diversity, and inclusion. During my career, I've been incredibly passionate about this subject, both as a player and now in my role as Director of Development at CONCACAF here in Miami. And for this panel, we have some truly global voices who are going to be contributing to this subject. I'm delighted to be hosting this session and have such a star-studded panel who I'll introduce now. First up, a man this side of the world who has been at the forefront of player action, challenging racism. Please welcome Justin Morrow of Black Players for Change, who is working for Toronto FC, having just retired. We are also honored to have Sarah Gregorius, the Director of Global Policy and Strategic Relations in Women's Football for FIFPro. Sarah is also a former New Zealand international. Good morning, Justin. Good morning, Sarah.
Hey, Jason.
Hey, Jason. Hey, Sarah.
How are you? It's a pleasure to see you. It's funny how in these conversations you get blessed to have these discussions with such influential people, and today is really no different. As we all know, Sarah and Justin, the fight against racism, homophobia, misogyny is very visible now. But for context, can you tell us what work you're aware of on fighting discrimination and pushing for EDI when you first started your football careers? We'll start that with Sarah.
It's a really good question, and it made me think that actually only recently was it called equality, diversity, and inclusion, because I remember back in the day, which also feels like a lifetime ago when I was playing, the discussion was just about diversity and inclusion. It actually wasn't about equality. So I think also just the fact that we now speak about equality, because certainly throughout my football career, there wasn't a hell of a lot of that around, also goes to show that a lot has changed recently, and we're sort of increasing our vernacular and vocabulary around it too, to hopefully include even more people and not just go down the path of getting them included, but getting people on equal playing fields as well, which I think is hugely important. So yeah, as I was sort of getting ready and prepping for this session with you both, I actually thought, it's only recently that I've heard the word equality being thrown around, because I think if you went back 5-10 years ago, it wasn't part of the discussion.
Absolutely agreed, Sarah. I've often thought of that in regards to the way that this agenda has grown, and equality, that pursuit of being equal, not of outcome, but of opportunity, has only recently been part of that discussion. I think of it like a party, like diversity is being asked to the party. That's the numbers. How many people did you invite to the party? And then inclusion is really being asked to dance, participating, making those numbers count for the people who are in the room. Listen, Justin, you've only just retired. First of all, how are you finding that?
Oh, I'm doing great. I'm still in the game. Like you said, I'm working for my club that I've been with for over 8 years now, and it's a joy to make the transition back into the game and be helping the young players out. So it's been good so far.
Incredible. So just setting the context, what can you remember work being done around these issues when you first started your career?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it starts way before my professional career. I grew up over here in America, Cleveland, Ohio. For all of you that don't know, it's not that diverse of a city. It might be changing a little bit now, but when I grew up, it was very racially divided along black and white lines. And as a footballer, in North America, it's pay to play, so it often excludes black people. And so whatever team I was on, I was one of two or one of three black players to be on the team. And through that, I faced a lot of microaggressions. And then as I started to excel in my school, starting to be in the paper a little bit more, I faced even more like visible backlash, like death threats and whatnot. And so that really set the tone for me as I transitioned to university and then to pro. And now having a platform, it was always in the back of my mind that I wanted to turn a negative experience into something positive, because I was fortunate enough to have all the support that I needed. My parents were on stable ground, good, loving family that provided everything for me. And so I was able to get past that. But I know that for a lot of young footballers, And a lot of young Black men and women in our community, they don't have that. And so it might be different for them. And so 2020 came around and we started Black Players for Change over here in response to George Floyd and everything that happened in Major League Soccer prior to that. You know, even as early as 2020, February 2020, you know, we had coaches using the N-word and getting fired in our league, and players not speaking up about it because they didn't feel the confidence to. And so, you know, when I entered the league, there wasn't any organization. There was just those veteran players that would look out for you. And now we have a body, an organization of players to look out for our young players, to create something that can fight with the league and push them in the right directions and really make sport over here in North America more inclusive.
Thank you for setting the tone there, Justin. Can you tell us a little bit more about the way that your organization has been engaging not only with the Black players and the community, but also the Black community as well as some of the other stakeholders?
Yeah, I mean, when we started, we were trying to figure out, okay, is this going to be a protest? And then when we got together and all started talking about it, you know, guys wanted something that we could look after the next generation, make sure that it's more inclusive, a better environment for them, and then pass it on to them. And so we created what's now a nonprofit. And we work on two tracks, really. On the first one, when we were deciding how we're going to make change in our own environment, was helping issues in the league. And so we meet with the commissioner regularly, as everyone, I'm sure we'll get into it, but, you know, there's been this explosion, this proliferation of DEI committees. And so we have a DEI committee that we share with team governors and some administrators in the league, some executives around the league and players. And we push things up like policy and programming with the league through that. But then, like you said, we're in our communities, and really what we're trying to do there is we're trying to show everyone and grow Black participation in the sport. And we do that through donations. We do that through making mini pitches in underserved communities. There's a lot of different ways, but really we just want to keep Black people at the forefront of this sport over here in North America.
That's really interesting, Justin, and we'll speak about that later on. But just like a late tackle, we have someone who's come in a little bit late now, and I'm not going to say it was like his challenges, but we're blessed to say that we have Nigel de Jong, ex-Dutch international, played in 7 different countries, including Manchester City, where I can say I still have a few bruises from the last time we saw each other on the football pitch. Nigel is currently an international pundit for beIN Sport. Nigel, pleasure to have you with us. Justin was just talking about the Black Players Coalition and how they've been able to engage with the stakeholders in North America. Why do you think we haven't seen something like this in England, as you spent a lot of time there during your career? Why haven't we seen players be more self-determined in setting up their own organizations to engage with the stakeholders of the game?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for your time as well. And you know, I was a hard man, but I have to say, Jason, you were one tough cookie as well on the pitches, and even so. I had some good memories. So, nevertheless, thank you for bringing me on. Back to your question, I think you know, been playing in the United Kingdom, in England as well. So there's a lot of problems that we see, and especially when it comes down to discrimination, racism, and equality. I think representation is one of the key factors that we miss, especially as Black players. If you look at the boardrooms, if you look at the organizations, football clubs, governing bodies, I think representation is key, because when you have somebody in a board that has the same skin color or grew up with the same kind of difficulties that you had, you can relate to a certain person in that board, and he can tell his story and come across as well for the players that are being abused on the pitch. So I think representation and being relatable towards somebody in the boardrooms is key in this also to go forward. We see not enough of it. We have to make sure that more and more Black executives are on certain boards, men or female. And I think that's also the key now, that you see that a lot of players are starting their own little individual unions because they don't see any change. You know, we've been talking about it. All these advertisement and marketing is well done, but it's been forgotten over a while. That we see also now, after the whole discussion about racism after George Floyd incident in the U.S. and that came across in Europe. We see a lot of this I would say representation among minorities, but it is not enough. And I think that's one of the main keys. I think representation and being relatable also to somebody that is represented in the organization of governing bodies.
Thank you, Nigel. And Sarah, you and I are one of are two individuals who are in relatively prominent positions within stakeholders. And my personal view is, of course, we need more representation, but I think the onus is on people like myself and yourself and Justin, etc., people who are sitting with stakeholders and amplifying our voices in the moments that are important. I think diversity in decision making is so important, to be able to hear different voices as you craft what is an appropriate response or an appropriate strategy to a number of different things, not just in ED and EDI. Shira, what's your view on representation, how we can continue to move the needle with the stakeholders and governing bodies?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think for me, it's two things. Yeah, we need more diversity in the room. Like Nigel's so right. Like having people in those rooms, being part of the decision making, drawing on their own experiences is certainly important. What I'm always quite wary of is, like you say, Jason, I think when you obviously display certain characteristics, sometimes the burden then falls on you to kind of carry the message on behalf of that community, let's say, which also can be quite tough, I think, as well, particularly if you're a person who is speaking from a place of experience, but also sometimes speaking from a place of trauma. I think that's also, it can be quite a triggering experience, and I think it can be mentally quite draining. So I think the other part of it for me, and I say this quite a bit and I don't pull any punches about it, it's like you don't have to be Black to speak about Black issues. You don't have to be a woman to speak about women's issues either. Anyone can be an expert on anything that they choose, right? Obviously, you need the diversity and you need people with the lived experience. But if it's about policy or regulation for change in a certain area, the onus is on every single one of us to do their homework and to do their research and be an expert and be someone that can bring a point of view to the table. I think too often people sort of have this, I'll give you a very real example. I was at a conference last week speaking about maternity and pregnancy policy, and this is a regulation issue. So there's no reason why every lawyer, male or female, would not be in a position to kind of grow their interest and expertise in this. Just some are not making a conscious decision to do so. So for me, it's still those two things, right? It's having more diversity in the room, but it's not putting the burden on a certain individual to carry a certain message. It's like, okay, what can I do either in an advocacy or allyship role to just provide equality and inclusion for everybody, right? So I think that kind of, sometimes I get a little bit frustrated with people saying, oh, we have to wait for the gender of leadership to change in order to talk about these issues. It's like, well, that's not true. Like, it's well within everyone's power to educate themselves on the women's football industry, for example, or educate themselves on what may or may not be minority issues and bring that point of view forwards.
So I think that's a really important point in regards to around the table or in these rooms, trying to make allies out of people who may not necessarily know the issue, but also encouraging them to educate themselves on the issue so you can have a more informed discussion, and turning people who may not be as in the weeds as some people are in this topic, but actually turning them into allies and people who are comfortable having those discussions. You mentioned trauma, Sarah. How does that manifest itself in regards to online and social media? How do we view some of the challenges we see in regards to disrespect and or abuse online?
Yeah, what sometimes frustrates me about the online conversation and social media abuse is people have this attitude of, well, why don't you just turn it off? Why don't you just not be online anymore? And I think for players, that can actually have sometimes a financial consequence, right? Because now so much of their overall revenue generation opportunities comes from being online. I think it's now an expectation of a lot of sponsors and a lot of commercial partners for players to make a certain type of content and promote certain products. And then I think, sure, if someone tweets me something hateful, yes, I am affected, and yes, it may be something that triggers trauma or whatever it may be for me. But there are also a lot of other people that then bear witness to that abuse as well. So it's also not necessarily about the individual. It could be like, I mean, she doesn't have Twitter, bless her, but maybe my mum logs on that day and she sees something that really upsets her. It's not written to her, it's written to me or about me, right? So I think there's this whole holistic environment around social media abuse that isn't about the person giving it and the person receiving it, right? It's meant to be an online community and everybody sees everything, provided, it's all public and we have the blue tick and our profiles are out there, right? So I think that to me is not discussed enough in some respects. It's like, it's not just about the individual and who's being targeted and whatnot. Everybody is seeing what's being said on these platforms, and that can have a different type of effect. It can manifest itself in a different way. So I would really like to see it sort of expanded. I honestly don't even really know sometimes what to say to these platforms and how to make them really understand how massive of a problem this is. But it does concern me that we have these environments in which it's just very common to see abuse, and it's very common to see not just racist or sexist abuse, but also xenophobia, homophobia, and it's almost like we don't treat that as seriously when in fact it could be just as harmful.
Nigel, what's your thoughts on the role of the big sponsors, the broadcasters, who of course play in leagues? They pay the leagues, they pay the clubs, the associations for their rights and visibility. Do you think they can use their power to push for social change?
Yeah, certainly. But it is very difficult, in order to get these sponsors in a way that they have to understand that diversity and racism is much more than only filling their own pockets, because you have to also think about the financial aspect that these sponsors and broadcasters are dealing with. The majority of percentage of the people, subscribing or being a part of their program, is a wide audience. So it's really tricky, for them to also, push that forward, and how important it is to have diversity in a certain channel. Nevertheless, I think you have to start somewhere. This is inherited for so many years. This is nothing. This is not something that you can push out in the next couple of months in order to show advertisement or make people aware that discrimination is there on television. This goes way more deeper than that. And what I said, everything happens, with representation and also being relatable. So, we had this discussion before, talking about what is it then in the UK that you need to have in certain organizations and government bodies. That's a similar thing in the big companies and broadcasters in the paying leagues. You need representation in order to make the change from within the company. And then you can push it out in the right way that everybody can relate to it, and especially the people of color or the minorities. So it is a role that they need to have. I felt a little bit of, I have to say, unease when it came down to last year and a half, because it came a little bit across for me when the marketing strategy came out, in a sense of, yeah, we have to do it because the rest of the world is in an emotional roller coaster when it comes down to racism, diversity, and equality. So they pushed it because they had to. And now we see a little change in that sense, that it is a little bit pushed in the background. So that being said, you have to make people aware on a daily basis that it's still alive in whatever sector it is. So yes, the role of the big sponsors is definitely a part of, but it has to change from within. If you don't make the change from within, then for the outside, it's only scratching a small surface, and you won't do enough.
Justin, sponsors, broadcasters, what can they do more?
Yeah, I mean, I thought Nigel spoke on it really well. The other thing I'll say is, like, they bring big dollars, right, and a lot of eyes, and I feel like when we're continuing to tell this story, as Nigel said, like keeping it in the consciousness, they have to think of it almost as just like a social impact, they have KPIs, they have all these different metrics by which they assess whether programming is worth it. But when they're telling the story of Black people through content, through docuseries, through podcasts, whatever it be, it has to be outside of that. It has to lay outside of that. It has to be a commitment, especially from the broadcasters, to do it without trying to fit it into their normal business model, because forcing it is a little bit of what it's going to take right now. So for me, just being in that environment and dealing with sponsors and broadcasters, that's how I'm experiencing it. They try to, whenever they're coming at it, they try to fit it into their normal business model, and it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, and I think there's a conversation to be had around good diversity is good business. This is about making your organization better. This is about making your outcome, your bottom line better through diversity. And I think that's a shift in focus that we all need to be part of. I just want to come back to you specifically on football clubs, Justin, and how you think they work in the area of EDI, about addressing abuse or sorting out the diversity in the game in regards to the best opportunities for people to get further chances to coach or manage, etc. We've seen you join Toronto FC in a technical capacity. What do you think clubs can do to make sure, and what's the benefits of them making sure that they have a more diverse technical staff?
Yeah, it's like you just said, understanding that having more diverse staff is going to help them, the success of the club on the field and off the field. We've been dealing with this a lot over here as we've gone through coaching changes and whatnot. And when we start going through a hiring process and fielding candidates and whatnot, I had an interesting conversation with the head of our HR department. And we were speaking about the lack of Black candidates, but Black coaching candidates, and both for business opportunities as well. And we were trying to figure out, who has the responsibility to grow that pipeline, because obviously that takes programming, that takes money, that takes a lot of effort. But at the end of the day, it's the club, it's the employer's responsibility to grow that pipeline, because if not, you're going to continually have, at least where we are right here in Canada and North America, a lack of Black candidates. And because the Black candidates don't believe that they can actually get the job, so they don't apply. If we don't work from an employer side to build that up and give them the experience that is required, I mean, that's a whole nother conversation about what's required and who we think is qualified and not qualified. But unless we do that, it's not going to come. And if we truly believe that it's going to make our business, and we're going to make our football better by having Black candidates and more diverse candidates, then we need to do that. So that's kind of where we're at right now.
That's the plan, yeah.
Thank you, Justin. Really a question for all of you. I'll start with you, Sarah, in regards to the global context of the game. FIFA, UEFA, CONCACAF, all of the confederations, we said, done some good symbolic work. What would you like them to do in challenging racism in the game? Is there a way that FIFA and the confederations and all the big groups across the game can maybe be more aligned on a strategy instead of having separate ones across different parts of the world? Notwithstanding, there are some nuances to that, but the overall agenda of equality, diversity, and inclusion.
Yeah, I think you nailed it with the recognition that there's nuances. I think diversity and inclusion in its definition cannot look the same everywhere. It's not the same in South America as it maybe is in Western Europe, and to go further around the globe again. I think, though, what I would hope that those organizations could be aligned on is how damaging hate speech is. So I don't think it really matters particularly what region or part of the world there is. Every part of the world has hate speech. And I think we can go a long way to kind of really doubling down on trying to remove that from our sport. I think it is difficult to say that there is, like, for example, and this is, I'm speaking in broad terms, but in Eastern Europe, discrimination looks different to what it maybe does in Eastern Africa, for example. But I would guarantee that those regions definitely have a lot of hate speech, and a lot of that comes through, football it's a sport that brings out a lot of passion, and it can bring out the worst and the best in people. And when it brings out the worst, it brings out, discriminatory language in particular. and I think you see a lot of words around, we have this zero tolerance attitude, but it's a value statement as opposed to something that you see really put into action, particularly in stadiums where we've seen a lot of abuse that players have suffered directly from fans, sometimes even directly from opponents or officiating members as well. So I think the unifying strategy should really be around hate speech, and I think there's definitely work to be done to regionalize that and to figure out what it is and how it manifests itself in the different parts of the world. So, but when it comes to equality, I feel like that's pretty straightforward. And you can start as simply as looking at your competition regulations and be like, okay, do we treat men and women the same in their different competitions? And if we don't, well, that's a really good place to start. So I think there are some sort of ways in which you can get runs on the board, but I certainly think the unifying strategy should be equality in and of itself, but certainly something around hate speech too, and just trying to take it out of our game.
Nigel, what can the global stakeholders, FIFA, the confederations, what can they do, similar to the question to Sarah, what can they do more holistically, more aligned to challenge some of the issues that we face in EDI?
Well, that's always going to be the million-dollar question, isn't it? Because, the majority of the problems, they're already there. They had been there for many years. And of course, we've seen over the last couple of months what happened with racism in football and how it's such a big topic right now. Inequality, what Sarah has been talking about, women's football in general as well. I'm having more women's representatives that are Black as well in the governing bodies. I think recruitment is one thing. I keep hammering on it. And of course, you cannot change from the top straight away. But I would like to relate to somebody that have the same color of skin as me, and that I have, that is intelligent enough and as well to tackle these issues. It can't come from an individual union as the players. Some of the players are making right now. I mean, the governing body's got to do more in order to make the awareness better when it comes down to social media, from a young age, teaching the kids as well, what it is that it is racism and discrimination, and also equality, and some of the stuff that is really comes down to how kids are getting raised inside of the households. We all been raised in a certain way. With certain values, and you don't really see that anymore nowadays, and especially with social media, because social media gives everybody an outlet to say whatever they want, and that is very scary in a sense. I got 2 kids of my own, so I know what the impact can have. Being a black kid on social media, and if you do something negative, for example, or you underperform as an athlete, so we see that more and more. So I think the governing bodies, they really have to focus on putting certain values in place, but also recruit, just not based on the color of your skin. That doesn't matter.
Justin?
Yeah, I think they actually have a very unique opportunity. Being over here in North America, one of the most exciting things for me since I've been in this area has been connecting with my peers, NBA players, NFL, NHL, tennis player. I mean, you name it. We've all been talking to each other a lot. And like Nigel said, there's been a lot of like splinter organizations. I mean, you see what the women are doing in the WNBA, sorry, the NWSL. Those women have really taken charge of the issue. They've been fighting for a number of different years. And there's so many organizations, so many new organizations, but football has, it's the world sport, and so it has more than any other sport the opportunity to reach all places of the globe, and because of that, I really think they're best positioned to make an impact and to bring everyone together and harmonize on this issue. But that takes a lot of effort, and I don't know if FIFA's as a governing body are up to something like that. I haven't seen that from them in the past. And even I would think within their own organization, they would need stronger minority leadership for something like that to happen. And so it's not something that I'm hopeful will happen, but I do recognize that they, as as an organization are in pole position to actually move the needle on something like this.
So Justin, without giving away confidences, what does that discussion sound like when you have players or individuals or high profile individuals from sport who are talking about what responsibility, what opportunity they have to move things on with their own platforms, with their own influence, with their own voices? Are we wrong to solely be looking at the leaders of the game to do this? And is this actually about those who are on the pitch, on the tennis courts and on the basketball courts?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a global effort for sure. But when you start to talk to people across continents and bring them together in conversation, you start to understand that the environments in different continents are way different in the way that we deal with this issue. And so the safety is behind some type of organization, because if I'm speaking to footballers over in the UK, the things that they have to deal with, Sarah was talking about social media blowback and how they've had to deal with that. I mean, that's not, now they're dealing with it in social media, but they've been dealing it in traditional media and print and broadcast media for a long time. And not only, as she said, does it have to do with the person that it's impacting, but it also alters attitudes and actions for those that are just experiencing it. So what I'm trying to say is maybe someone over there would be hesitant to speak up because they fear of what's going to happen if they do. And so once you start talking about individual platforms, we see over here what happened to Colin Kaepernick. We see over there what's happening to certain high-profile athletes that speak up and get killed for it. And so for me, the safety is always behind numbers, behind all of us doing it together. And ideally, that would be behind some type of organization. So the responsibility is there for all of the players to start the conversation. And then ideally, at some point, we need to coalesce into some form, and that's going to bring the most power.
Nigel, you've played in 7 countries. You've probably seen different contexts. What you've seen in England is very different to Turkey or wherever else that you've played in your career. What do you see as the responsibility and the opportunities for players to be more visible in regards to this?
I think it's very important. I think Justin touched base a little bit on that. I think it is also players want a safe haven, to express their feelings as well, because you deal with so many other issues when you speak out against racism and discrimination and equality, because you know that it can have a big backlash on you, because you're dealing with fans, you're dealing with sponsors, you're dealing with an organization that pays you as well salary-wise. So the majority have a certain fear, to speak out in a sense. And there always have to something needs to happen first in order for us to speak out. With the George Floyd situation or situation that happens on the pitch, in order to speak out. But when that passes, we still have to have a voice in order to go forward and just to make people aware of what's going on in the world of sports, and that racism is still alive. So I think the players, they need a representative union, I would say, or organization feel free also to make their statements and give their opinions, and that are backing them up regardless of having the backlash of social media or from their own clubs or from their own fans. I think that's really important going forward, because if you don't talk about it and you don't make it aware every time you speak about it, nothing will change. And that's what I said, before something happened with the George Floyd incident that flew over from the United States, everybody was one and united. And you could see it from left and right and different kinds of angles that the sport was coming. But now that flew over a little bit, we still have to make this awareness going on. And I played in different countries, and every country has its own kind of idea of marketing or push it forward, that there has to be more awareness of racism. In some countries, they don't even care about the whole situation about discrimination, equality, and racism. So it's such a juggle, being a black athlete, to go from place to place and see where you fit in the sense of, being successful as you can be. So it is really important for an athlete to have a safe haven in that sense, to speak out, because we always expect white people to talk about racism, but black people, they have to talk about racism in the sense that everybody understands it as well. And that comes again with being relatable with some of the executives that are in government bodies. So you can relate yourself, so you know what they're talking about. Because otherwise, it's a loop. You say something, but you know the other side will not understand what you're talking about because they never went through that process. So it's so important also just to have that circle going on, in a sense of, you know, having an organization and a union where you can feel free to speak your mind up.
Sarah, that this talk has got me thinking about intersectionality, and how different is it with fighting discrimination in the women's game? And there's enough being done there. I've really heard about the challenges of Black women in the same way as when we discuss these issues.
Yeah, it's a really strong point, and you touched on it right there with the word intersectionality. Sometimes I feel as if we, broadly speaking, we're not quite mature enough in where we're at and in terms of this conversation to talk about where gender intersects with being like of a minority background, a Black or brown person. I just don't think we're ready to understand the experience of, I think already as a female athlete, as a women's footballer, you're marginalized. You're marginalized as a woman, and then you're further marginalized if you're a woman of color. And I think it's even more strong if we look across the board and we look at positions of true influential leadership. Black women, to be quite frank, are just nowhere to be seen, really, statistically. So I think that's why it's such a challenge to have that conversation. And I do think sometimes the approach is, you cannot talk about two things at once, right? You can't talk about racism and sexism because one will distract from the other. So again, that's what I mean around not quite having the maturity to speak about both at the same time without somehow people feeling as if you're going to delegitimize or not give enough attention to one topic, where actually intersectionality is hugely important because it can completely change someone's experience within the sport, let alone talking about someone who comes from, you know, a totally other, whether it's religious minority or issues around LGBTQIA+ too. So I just think we're not in a position yet to have those conversations. But I will say that it's similar to Justin's experience with Black Players for Change. We do have the Black Women's Players Collective in the US that was formed within the NWSL, and they do a lot of activism. They do a lot to bring their point of view and their experiences forward. And I think it's really important that we make sure that when there are opportunities or instances where players particularly are wanting to bring, you know, more nuanced topics to the fore and talking about intersectionality and the way that that can manifest itself for them, we really do have to listen because it is a fundamentally different experience as well. And we can't lose that. I think you don't want to be in a position where you're leaving anybody behind in this conversation. I think it's a shame that we don't hear enough about it, but I do think slowly as we get more mature in this discussion, we'll be able to speak about those issues for marginalized groups within already marginalized groups as well.
Excellent point, Sarah. And one of my frustrations when I'm having these discussions about EDI is that often it's placed like, well, Jason, we have a problem with equality, diversity, and inclusion. What can we do to fix it? And very much asking me to come up with this one-size-fits-all idea that would fix everything through my experiences. And I hope I'm not going to do that right now. What I'm going to ask is, let's move to solutions. What do we think? What's the one thing that we think that can be done to further move the dial forward? I'll start with you, Sarah. What do you think can be done to improve the situation tangibly from where we are right now?
I think Nigel already said it and Justin touched on it as well, but we just have to increase representation at the pointy end of the game. We really do. We need more diversity in decision-making bodies, in governing bodies. I heard a really good quote, and I do love a good quote the other day, and it was like, change is like a tree. It starts from the roots. And I think if you look at it from that point of view and you think of the decision makers as kind of the roots of this tree, if we don't get change there, then none of the other problems are actually going to find solutions in a sustainable way. We'll keep having these sort of piecemeal approaches where we put a Band-Aid here or we put a Band-Aid there. And this is also where the hardest challenge will be, because everybody loves a value statement. Everybody loves maybe putting up a rainbow flag or saying Black Lives Matter and all of that kind of thing. But when you're asking someone to step aside or step down from leadership in order for there to be more fundamental change, for someone else to come in and take their position that can maybe offer a different point of view, then there's crickets, man. Like, then everybody stops talking. And so I think it's the most obvious and immediate win, but it's also the biggest challenge, because people love power and they don't want to give it up. And they certainly don't want to give it up once they've had it for a long time and they're very used to being in these comfortable rooms and these comfortable environments with people that look and sound like them, right? But it's actually, honestly, where we will get the biggest fundamental changes is if we can just improve the diversity in those top rooms, around those top tables.
Nigel?
I mean, Sarah, that was a fantastic speech. I mean, you know, she was in one of my MIP classes, and she gave a fantastic speech about being representative, representing the female side of things. And you know, I mean, she says she was spot on. I keep saying it. Being a representation and being relatable as well. I think that is key going forward. You know, we all do these classes. We all go back to school. We all have our own ideas and opinions. But once you get it across, then to try to, you know, to shift the needle in terms of the power that the majority of these executives have, and to let us replace their position, then it's second to none. Then you come in a situation that is like, wait a minute, hold up. I love it to a certain point. We want to give you a certain podium to a certain point, but that's it. So I think recruitment is key. I think the governing bodies really have to understand, like, even going forward, and not try to have this conversation over and over again. I think the recruitment in letting these people across the boardrooms is key in this sense. So yeah, I'm totally agree with Sarah in that case. I think that's the biggest challenge, but also the solution going forward, because you can say only so much, you know, as being underneath the ladder. But if you're on top of that ladder, then you have the biggest say in the power. So you have to make changes there in order to make the changes below there. So yeah, that's the same answer for me.
Justin, I have to ask you a little bit more pointed, because you are in North America. This challenge has been seen in different industries, and there's been different solutions, and in sport there's been different policies and procedures put in place. We all agree representation. From your experience, what could be done to shift that representation process?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. There has been a little bit of change in policy and programming and some of these roles. Like, every organization has a director of EDI now. I think the dollars are a little bit looser. You know, companies are willing to spend on the issue, but unless we really focus our efforts, it's not going to happen. And that comes through changing culture. I think the way that we get towards more representation, first off, is from the players continuing to push. You know, I think as I talk to anyone in these high level positions, they only have so much power if the players are backing them. Really, if the players are like continuing to push day in and day out, because players make the game. You know, it's at the end of the day, it's all about them. This game is nothing without them. And so if they're continuing to push, then we have a greater chance of speeding up the process. The other thing that is starting to happen a little bit over here, which I'd like to see happen across the globe, is Black ownership. And so I think in MLS we have like 10 Black NBA players that are minority investors in teams, couple rappers, couple females, actresses, singers, stuff like that. I think that this issue speeds up if we have ownership that comes from minority background, racialized background, Black backgrounds. And so my dream is, and I think this will happen someday soon, is that, you know, there's a Black consortium of entrepreneurs and entertainers that buy an MLS club. And I think the same model could work in Europe. And I think through that, we can see representation change quicker, because what has to happen, Sarah and Nigel spoke about this, the people at the top have to genuinely care about this. You can put all policies, you can put all this programming in place, but nothing changes unless the people at the very top care about this issue. And I think that happens when you start to get Black people in there. So that's what I'd like to see.
Couldn't have ended it in a better way. So representation is important, creating allies from decision makers in the room. Players are owning the game and have a huge voice in not only this issues, but other issues of governance. That Black ownership is important to be able to showcase talents at various levels and across the gambit of football. I could continue this conversation all day. Maybe we'll stay on after this and continue talking, but we have to leave now. We have a really important session on NFTs, which, okay, maybe I won't be able to stay on because I'm gonna have to watch that as well. But that's sadly all that we have time for. Conscious there's a lot to cover and say. Hope that this has started a discussion. And I hope that you found this session useful and it helps to influence the work taking place in this area of the game. Of course, we all know we have a lot of work to do, but a big thanks to all of the panel. Your time is really valued. Thank you, Nigel. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Justin, for spending some time with us here at the MIP Alumni. We're really lucky to have you in the game as our representatives. Thank you, and on to the next.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.